Welcome back to the baking part of our tutorial. The first thing that I want to remind you of, for the case you haven't watched the introduction or you already forgot, we need a script. So I'm going here on scripting and I say new script, file, open, detach elements, and then all we have to do is open, go to tools and say evaluate all, and that makes 3D Max remember that it has this script installed next time you boot it up. And in here it already gives us an indication what to look for. Split elements into separate objects. So I'm going here to customize user interface and I type in split. And here we have it, split elements into separate objects. So I'm gonna put it here on my numpad key, on the 9 to be particular. Assign and close. And now what we can do with that, earlier we attached everything together here, but for this step we just wanna detach everything again. So I'm just gonna press this letter and now we have all these individual objects here, which is pretty cool. And let me show you why we need to do this. Let me bring up the high poly folder and overlay it with our low poly. That basically shows us how our normal map and the other maps will get baked onto our low poly mesh. And this here is a very good example of something that obviously wouldn't work if we kept all that here together as one piece and bake it like that. That would result in the safety switch here getting some information that we don't want. Like this piece here is only supposed to be a floater that's supposed to affect the receiver here. So in the previous days, we would then just take the stuff that's in the way, select it, both the low poly and the high poly, and push it out of the way, which is also referred to as exploding the mesh. So in order for this to work in the past, we would then just take one bit at a time and explode it out of the way. Like here, all these pieces would be somewhere floating in the viewport like that, so that the rays that the normal map requires to project the information don't get confused by any intersecting geometry. However, thanks to Substance Painter, this is no longer necessary. We can keep everything together as one piece, which is much more convenient. So what is this mysterious new method all about that Substance Painter uses? It's completely based on naming convention. It means that we can bake out this mesh here as one piece without having to explode it, because we give things the appropriate name. So for instance, this piece here is the stock. So I don't do it quite yet, but let me just explain you how it works. The low poly of the stock here would then be called stock underscore low. And the high poly, we would call it stock underscore high. And everything that is a floater on it, we would also call stock underscore high. So that tells Painter then later that these parts belong together, and one is the high poly information and everything else is low poly that just needs to get the normal map and all the other maps baked onto. A very nice way of working. So let's continue with this. And our friend and helper for this task is hidden here under Tools and Rename Objects. Let's bring that up and let's keep the high poly opened here for the moment, because just to demonstrate it here properly, I'm going to call the stock here as a base name stock, as simple as that, and as a suffix underscore low. So let's just rename that here. And now I'm going to call the suffix underscore high and select everything here that is actually the high poly stock. And that includes all these floater elements. Not this screw here, just this thing here surrounding it. And the same goes for this and this. And let's see what else. Those bits here. And I will then just hit the rename. And now all these bits here are called stock high. And that will tell Painter to identify that as high poly, so that Substance Painter later knows exactly what belongs where. And I actually forgot that this piece here is also a floater for the stock. So let's also call it stock underscore high here. Let's rename it. And then we have this piece here, which I think is called a swivel. So I'm going to call it that. Actually, let's select the high poly first, because we already have underscore high written here. Going to rename it, select the low poly, and change it to low, and also rename. And let's see what we have left. This element here, I'm actually going to call it stock element underscore low, and the same for this high poly piece of it, but of course with underscore high. Let's rename that. And that concludes the stock already, everything named properly. Let's continue with the receiver. And the receiver might look a little intimidating because it has all these floaters and objects, but that's nothing to worry about. What we want to do is identify our screws here first. So in that case, I'm going to close the high poly, it makes it easier to select. Let's select them one by one. All these screws here belong to the receiver. So with all of them selected like this here, let's make sure we didn't forget any. I'm just going to call it receiver screws underscore low and rename this. And let's already rename the receiver itself since we're already there. So I'm just gonna get rid of the underscore screws here and call it receiver underscore low. And that's all for the receiver here for the low poly. So let's jump back to our high poly. And let's make selections here for all these screws. And I guess I already attached them together earlier, at least those bolt heads here. So we can then just continue here with those screws that we really need. Gonna make a selection here for everything. Everything that we unwrapped earlier, we want to bake onto. And actually, let me open the low poly and overlay it so that we're sure we don't miss anything here. But that looks about right to me here. So I'm going to call it the same what we called it earlier for the low poly, and call it receiver underscore screws underscore high. Say rename. And I also select the actual high poly receiver, of course. and also gonna call it receiver underscore high. And let's not forget that we still have a few floaters here on it that also need to be called receiver underscore high. So I'm going to select them one by one here. That also includes that text here, by the way. And on that side, we have this piece here and all these bits. Again, let's make sure we didn't forget anything here on the receiver, because it has quite a few parts. But that looks about right, and I will just also call it receiver underscore high. And that basically concludes the receiver here in terms of naming everything properly. Next, let me continue with the pistol stock here. Pistol stock underscore low. And let me select the high poly bits. Those two here. And those are pistol stock underscore high. As simple as that. And actually, again, I forgot this screw here at the bottom. So this one is also pistol stock underscore high. Rename. And next, I'm going to work here on the safety switch. Safety switch underscore high. Rename and select the low poly for it and call it low. And that thing here, I guess we could call it safety switch screw underscore low. And this piece here would be the underscore high. I forgot a little piece here. Safety switch underscore high. Let's just copy it also here to this fella. That also belongs to the high poly. And actually that's the best way of working here with the high poly overlaying the low poly. So I'm just gonna close the Scene Explorer for now because it's just in the way basically. Let me continue with the spring here. This one, I'm gonna call it spring underscore low. Rename. Usually in the X-ray mode is the easiest way to quickly select your high poly, by the way. Can sometimes be a little annoying to select the right bits. So this one here would be spring underscore high. And next we can take our upper receiver, underscore low and rename. And let me already switch this here to high. And select our high poly upper receiver. And let's not forget to also select our floater geometry for it. Here on that side we also have this piece here. And other than that, I think this is everything for the upper receiver. So also upper receiver underscore high, we're just gonna rename. And that's it for the receiver bits. And as a next thing, let's take the trigger. Trigger underscore high. As well as trigger underscore low. Let's rename it. And let's take the trigger guard next. Trigger guard underscore low and rename. And trigger guard underscore high, of course, underscore high. Let's also rename this. And these screws here belong together with the trigger guard. So I'm going to select the geometry for it. Let's make sure it's the right one. And that is not it. Here we go. Oh, and this screw here. Yeah, sometimes it's annoying with the selection. So these are all the screws here for the trigger guard. And I'm going to call it trigger guard underscore screws underscore high. And now I'm going to try to make the same selection here for the low poly pieces. And that worked pretty well. So let's call it underscore low. And then we have the magazine catch here. Magazine catch. Underscore high is what we want. And also the low. Rename, and that would be that. And as the next thing, I'm taking the magazine itself, magazine underscore low, just one element here, and underscore high for the high poly magazine itself, as well as the floaters that come with it. Let's rename it. And this here would be the bolt carrier. Bolt carrier underscore high. And bolt carrier underscore low. Rename. And then let's attend here to the rear side. Rear side underscore low. And rear side underscore high. And this piece here is also an individual element that's not a floater. So also let's call it rear side cylinder underscore, or let's call it rear side screw underscore high. To be fair, the base name actually doesn't really matter, but it's just a matter of keeping it all organized here in the magazine, I find. So this one here would be the low. Rear side screw low. Just double check, okay. And then here that would be the rear side leaf. Underscore low. And we have quite a few floaters on it. Rear side leaf underscore high. And I'm also going to select this text here and rename it. And as for these bits, I really don't know what they're called, but I'm going to call it rear side underscore cylinder underscore low. Let's rename that. And of course, also for the high, rename. And then we have this piece here, which would be the rear side switch underscore high together with this piece here, which also belongs to it. Let's rename it. And that here would be the rear side switch. I know it's funny, I'm gonna call it underscore knob. Low, and same thing for the high poly here, underscore high, rename. And let's see what's left. This element here, I am also not sure exactly what it's called, so I'm gonna call it rear side element. Actually, I'm gonna call it element A. And this one here, rear side element A high. And this screw here, I'm gonna call it rear side element A screw low. And the same, of course, here for the high poly of it, rename. And this piece here, I'm gonna call it rear side element B underscore low. And as for the high, let's not forget that we have these pieces here that are also part of the high poly for it. So that's gonna be also rear side element underscore B underscore high. So then we have this thing here again, rear side underscore element B underscore screw. Select the high poly first, since we already have it written here, rename. And this thing here would be the low, rename. And next, let's work on the hand guard here. So that would be hand guard high, rename. And this piece here is also part of it, so also rename it. Oh, and we have this little element here, which is also supposed to bake on that. So I'm also gonna rename it here, handguard underscore high. And of course, as for our low poly, underscore low. And then here, I'm gonna call that thing the handguard upper underscore high. And this piece here would be the same thing in low. And I almost forgot that we have these pieces here. So let's select the high poly first. And I'm going to call it element rear side underscore high. And those guys here would be the underscore low. And then we have this piece here. I'm just gonna call it cylinder low, and this here would be the high. And then we have this piece here as well. Let's call it handguard metal underscore low. And And let's select the high poly here, underscore high. So one thing that I would like to do here for the front pieces, as you can see, our high poly pieces are separated. However, our low poly, I welded it together earlier and I shouldn't have done that at that point. It's better to keep them also separate, just like the high poly bits. So I'm just gonna take them here and detach them exactly as our high poly is detached. We just make a selection here from the inside of the barrel and grow it. And then select all the faces here on the muzzle brake. I'm gonna take it and detach it. And this here is also one element. I'm gonna detach it. So now we have exactly matching pieces here for both high poly and low poly, which is in that case the best to work with. So let's go ahead here with those elements. This one here would be the gas cylinder block, or actually just the gas cylinder, underscore high. Going to rename this here, and the same for the low. And that bit here is the gas cylinder, actually it's the gas block, underscore high. And those bits here also belong to that. So I'm gonna select them all, these floaters. And let's not forget to also select these ones here. And let's rename them. And one thing that I just noticed about it is that the high poly may appear a little bit too soft here on the edges. So what I want to do in that case is to first of all check how our chamfer looks like, and yes, this doesn't seem appropriate. Let's bring that in a little bit here, the chamfer amount. Like I was mentioning earlier, it's never too late to fix stuff when we see it. So that already looks like it fits better. And this piece here is actually overlapping here a little bit on the sides, which is also something that I don't want to have. So what I'm gonna do here, I just select these outer edges and delete them, and that really just leaves us with this shape where we want it, and it won't overlap here where we don't want it. So that is also all named correctly here. It's the gas block, and this piece here still needs to be called gas block underscore low. Gonna rename it. And let's continue with this piece here. I'm gonna call it barrel underscore low, as simple as that. And this one here would be the high. And let me select the floaters that will also be baked onto this. That would be that piece here, as well as this piece. Let's rename it. And this piece here as well. Let's rename that. And that leaves us here with this small bit. Gonna call it barrel element underscore low. Select the high poly and call it barrel element underscore high. And next would be that piece here. I'm gonna call it barrel cylinder underscore high and barrel cylinder underscore low. See that we didn't forget anything here, but that's really just that piece. And next is this element. Gonna call it front side underscore low. And let's just select everything here that is the front side high poly. Not that piece, however, but all these floaters here. And let's call it front side underscore high. Rename. And that piece here, let's call it front side cylinder underscore high. As well as low. And I guess that is another cylinder here, so I'm gonna call it front side big cylinder underscore high. As well as low. And here we have the front side, I'm gonna call it a needle underscore high. Select the low and also give it a proper name. And then we are just left with the muzzle brake underscore low, and the same for the high. And that basically concludes it here with the whole renaming things properly. Let me just double check that we really have everything named accordingly. And for that, I'm going to have a look here in our Scene Explorer, because every single object here in the high poly folder should have a proper name to it. So these things here sort alphabetically, sorted by name, and that already sounds suspicious. Cylinder, there shouldn't be anything called cylinder left. So selecting these will bring them up here in the viewport as well. And I must have forgotten these objects here earlier. Receiver high, and this here is also a floater that's supposed to go there. Let's also give that the receiver high. And while I'm at it, I could also bring that a little closer here to it. And then let's see for the other ones. Let me just go here in isolation mode and bring up the rename objects again. I'm gonna call that stock, actually stock screws underscore high, rename. And now I just have to do the same thing here for the low poly. All 5 of them. And let's call it low. Rename. And since I'm already here in the low poly, let's also check that we haven't forgotten anything here. And object sounds suspicious. Let's see. Oh yeah, we shouldn't have forgotten that piece. So let's just copy over the name from the high poly. Select the low poly, and I'm just gonna do it here up there on the right. Switch underscore low. And one thing that I saw earlier, because I already went ahead and I made a test bake, was that these faces here have a smoothing group problem. So I'm just going to bring up the UV editor again, bring up text tools, and just make double sure that this here has the smoothing groups from the UV shells. And now it appears to be fixed. So I'm just going to collapse this here. Now, the only other thing that I still want to do for as long as we are still here in 3D Max, and it won't be much longer, I promise, is to take this element here of the barrel that shares the information with this here. Like this is the piece that actually gets baked on. And I want to take this element here and I want to copy it over here in the inside of the handguard. It's on the reference images, like there, this is the continuation of the barrel inside here. And I also want to make sure that we have this element in there so that it's not just empty. And I'm gonna do the same thing here for the top part. Also notice how I scaled it up a little bit so that we actually see it. Maybe we can even scale it up a bit more like that. And with this piece then, I'm just gonna continue this, copy it over here. And make sure that it's properly aligned here. Looks about right. And as for that piece, I'm just gonna push it back around here, and this one can stay here. And that just looks nicer if there's an animation playing and you see a little bit like, oh, there's something in there. So now we're ready to export this over to Substance Painter finally, which means we are done here in 3D Max. The only thing that's really left is to assign a material to our low poly selection here. And let's call it AKM. Let's make sure we have a name assigned here for this material. Gonna go ahead here and assign it. This is important because Substance Painter will give the whole mesh a name based on the material that we assign to in 3D Max. And the only other thing that I want to do before I export is to take this magazine here and copy it over here to the side so that when we are in Substance Painter, we actually see what we are doing here in the inside. Because yes, we don't see it here. And one thing that I almost forgot to do here is to take this magazine that we just copied over here to the side and bring the UV editor up and bring these elements here out of the UV space by 1. Gonna collapse that here. And that's crucial because otherwise our normal map will look all strange if we forget to do this, because it's getting projected on here, and that again would be a case of getting false information. So as long as we have that, we're all good. So next step would be to just take this selected geometry here, the low poly, click on Max, go to Export, and go to Export Selected. Make sure you don't go to Export, just hit the Export Selected, or else the export will think it should export the whole scene where the selected is really only for our selection. So what I want to do now is to go to the FBX, since we have our low poly selected right now. And also I would like to point out that I have a folder here called Substance that I have within my working folder. It's just good to have one particular folder, which I like to call Substance, where all our future texturing and Substance Painter stuff is happening in, so that we don't get lost. So with this folder here, I'm going ahead and I'm just gonna call it AKM Low Poly, and I will export this, save. And this dialog will pop up. Really all you have to do is press OK. And that's it for the low poly. which leaves us with the high poly to export. So I'm going to the Scene Explorer and I close the low poly folder, select the high poly, hit Ctrl A, let's just make sure we have everything selected, and also go to Max, Export, and Export selected. And the only difference is that I would like to pick an OBJ instead of an FBX for the high poly geometry. I just find the OBJ is a really good format for high poly, and it's the one that I don't get a whole lot of problems with. So I will go ahead and call this here AKM_ high poly. Let's save this. And this pop-up will appear. By default, the texture coordinates are checked. If you want, you can really just uncheck that and it will save you a little bit of time to export that out, because we don't need texture coordinates. It's just our high poly geometry. So let's go ahead and export. And that is done. And I actually think that we should make a different video or a chapter for the substance part, because this here is all still Max and I think it's better to have a fresh video that starts with Substance Painter. So in order for that, I'm gonna end this video here and I will then see you in the next chapter where we will learn all sorts of cool things about Substance Painter and also how to bake our textures. I'll see you there.